Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew de Block from BirdLife South Africa, and this is now our seventh session of our 10-episode virtual Avitourism training. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're enjoying it thus far. We have had a number of webinars so far. Just to recap, we had a few technical webinars to start on Avitourism, bird ID, apps, tools, social media, etc., birding terminology and concepts. And then we got into some more birdie episodes, I guess you could say. We had the common birds of the garden route and Klein Karoo and birds of freshwater and estuaries with Justin Ponder. And today we have birds of the forest, and we've got a new guest speaker who's going to be talking to us, which is very exciting. For those of you joining for the first time, this is a training course designed around the garden route and Klein Karoo, collectively the Garden Route District, and is part of a broader Avitourism development project. If you'd like to know more about it, just let me know and I will send you our documents. It's great to have you all with us. These are our main stakeholders in this project, being led by BirdLife South Africa through me, the Avitourism project manager, through Intoto Retreat on the ground in the garden route. They're based in Sedgefield, and their director Roland Forvac is an important partner of ours. And then our funders, the Western Cape Government, through the Department of Economic Development and Tourism, and the Groots Cluster Biosphere Reserve based out of Riversdale. So today our webinar is on the birds of the forest, or I guess alternatively forest birding. Our speaker today is Cassie Carstens. Cassie is an employee of BirdLife South Africa. He is our Secretary Bird Conservation Project Officer, and I can't really say where he's based out of because he seems to be all over the country all the time. He's joining us from Dullstroom today. He's on his travels towards a conference, but Cassie is a forest birding expert. I guess you could say mainly because of his involvement in the Cape Parrot project over many, many years. So Cassie spent many, many hours and days and weeks and months and years in the forest experiencing all these fantastic birds, and he's going to be sharing a little bit with us today. So Cassie also presented a forest birding workshop at the Flock to the Wilderness event recently. So he's going to be drawing on that presentation and sharing with us today. So Cassie, thank you so much for spending the time. I'm going to invite you to share your screen and take it away.
Copy that, Guy, Andrew, and thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here this morning to present to you a topic that's something that has really consumed my life for a couple of years and something that I'm still very excited about, forest birding. As Andrew has said, this is just one of many in a series covering the entire garden route and Klein Karoo areas. So yes, do please tune in for the rest. I assume that your birding knowledge, your birding skills will really take a boost over the next couple of these training sessions. Today's talk, of course, forest birds. We will try and cover as many as possible within the allotted time. If you start by looking at bird habitat descriptions in whichever field guide or application you use, the list will grow very quickly and become rather unwieldy. So we will be able to spend hours discussing all birds of the forest, but we had to kind of cut it down in order to fit in today's presentation. So I've selected a few birds from the garden route area to talk about today, and hopefully we'll be able to enrich your knowledge and your skills to be able to identify them quite easily. Something that I'm equally interested in as a guide as well, if the birds are few and far between, it's always nice to talk about the forest. So we'll touch on a few ecological aspects of forests. We won't be able to dive as deeply as some or even me would like, but a little bit of a background I think will be very beneficial if you are just a bird watcher or even if you are a guide. So that's the plan for this morning. So I like to start with this one, and I assume this is a map that most of you have seen in the past, either in presentations like this or even in your own endeavors and discoveries. Biomes in South Africa. Now, immediately you can see the big ones. The green one, grasslands, the two biggest in South Africa. They cover a major proportion of the country, with Namakarua coming in a third. Immediately you'll notice that in the land, forests are marked as black, and here and there you can see a little speck of black sticking out amongst all the other colors. But black is not very well visible on this map. So let's remove all the others. That is where forests are located in South Africa. They occur in most of our provinces, You can see that the only place where they're slightly scarce is in the Free State and maybe the Northwest. But in the rest of the country, all along the escarpment on the eastern coast and southern section of the country, there are forests. And they are not very big compared to some of the others, unfortunately, despite being one of the most wonderful biomes that you could possibly. This map contains forests that are larger than 10 hectares. So, of course, there are ones that are slightly smaller, but most forests in South Africa are about, 12 hectares in size. Hectare, of course, for those of you who haven't heard of that, 100 by 100 meters. That's the size. So, an example, for instance, in Mpumalanga, your average forest size in that entire province is about 29 hectares. The entire majority of South Africa are very small. You won't find ones. But let's look at some of the bigger ones so that you can target them maybe for future travels and future exploration. Duku Forest in KwaZulu-Natal, Zululand, 3,500 hectares in size. Never been there, unfortunately. I hope to still visit. A new resident, new KwaZulu-Natal. So I hope to explore all the great forests that the province has to offer. If you go slightly north into Limpopo, around Tanin, the Woodbush, the Hoek Forest Complex is the largest in the northern parts of the country. For those of you familiar with one of the icons of South Africa's Avitourism project, Mr. David Letsuala, he is a guy that is, I assume, accompanied many South Africans and international visitors looking at birds in that specific forest complex. I've had the privilege of chasing parrots there on numerous occasions, and it is a truly wonderful forest to explore. As Andrew mentioned a little bit earlier, I spent a large part of my life in the Amatola Mountains of the Eastern Cape, and in that specific province, the Piri Ise Kubusi complex is the largest in the Eastern Cape, more than 8,000 hectares in size. That's now, of course, part of this Amatola forest complex, which clocks in just over 40,000 hectares. So quite an important part of forests in South Africa, and of course the stronghold for the Cape parrot, the species bird of the year for 2023, as most of you will definitely know. But the area that we are focused on today, Garden Route in Knysna, is the largest contiguous forest in South Africa, more than 25,000 hectares. The specific forest in that Knysna area is part of the Greater Garden Route Forest Complex, the largest as well in the country, over 60,000 hectares in size. So those are the largest forests in South Africa. If you would now collate all of those small little black dots and blotches on this map, how much space will you be able to cover? Well, it's about 5,000 square kilometers, just over. Now, that sounds like quite a lot of area. Yes, it is quite big. But if you bring that slightly into context, the municipality of George, I assume that if you visit the Garden Route, you might have driven through it. That is 5,191 square kilometers, the entire municipal area. So you can take all the forests in South Africa, all of them, and squash them into the George municipal area, and there will still be space to spare. So viewing the forest in South Africa as small as that does point to its unique and rareness across the South African biome landscape. Now, I assume that some of you have traveled to Africa and maybe have visited some of the other forests beyond the Garden Route area. Some of you might think, well, a forest is a forest is a forest. There are trees. I know what a forest is. There are some slight differences as you travel across the country. And there's quite a few different ones that you might encounter, each with its own unique suite of birds that will enrich the time that you spend there. Now, this specific activity we're diving in now is called floristic biogeography. It's now looking at the plant diversity in a specific area and how that is distributed across the globe. In South Africa, they classify forests into 26 types. Now, we're not going to dive into all of them. It just takes way too long, but there's a rough list of the 13 or 12 that we will cover today. Like, we're going to look at those zonal groups. So that's broader blockages or broader groupings of forest in South Africa. Now let's discuss the azonal ones first. Those ones are the ones marked in blue at the moment. So low-felt riverine forest, mangrove forest, and swamp forests are the three azonal groups. Now, if you quickly think what makes them special, what makes them azonal, well, they've all got a water component: riverine, mangrove, and swamp. So that puts them slightly outside of the normal forest, which is now the remaining 9 of those on that legend list. So let's just take a quick moment to show you how these are distributed across the country. Let me go back home, KwaZulu-Natal, quickly, and let's look at some of the ones that occurs in that province. If we now zoom in a little bit deeper, you'll see far northern Zululand on the Mozambique border, sand forest. So right next to it, that azonal forest we just spoke about, low-felt riverine forest. Along the coast, St. Lucia, Isimangaliso, there you'll get northern coastal forest. Swamp forest in that area as well. So another one of the azonals. You go slightly inland, then you get scarp forest. Scarp, of course, named after the escarpment. So it's forest patches that occur in this rising altitudinal area across the country. Along the Lesotho border, you'll get northern Afro-temperate forest. And then along the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands, there's southern mist belt forest. So just in the KZN area, you can see there are so many varieties of forest. And if you now travel from the southern sections, which is southern mist belt, you might encounter Cape parrots, neither Tiracos, trogons. But as you go up north into the sand forests on the Mozambique border, there you'll get broadbill, Livingston, Sirocco. So an entire different suite of birds is spread across all these different types of forest. We don't really worry about KwaZulu-Natal too much today. We want to go down south garden route. So not as many, not as big a variety as you would get in KwaZulu-Natal or even some of the other provinces. In this area, a bit of southern mist belt. There's a little bit of southern coastal around Gqeberha. And then, of course, the big one that we are focused on today, southern Afro-temperate forest. So you are in that specific type of forest when you travel in the garden route area. Each one of those specific forest types got a certain suite or component of trees, certain trees that dominate, that make up certain lower levels, higher levels, mid-levels of the forest. And that is the main description that you can give to forest. It's made up of layers. So if you walk in a forest, you'll definitely identify this. If you have been in one, it's quite easy to now determine that, yep, this specific image describes a forest quite well. You've got a floor area, you've got the understory below the forest canopy, you've got the canopy area where all the main crowns of the trees are located, and then the emergent layer, which are all the very, 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 very big and tall trees that stick their heads out of the forest and above the canopy. Now, those, for instance, yellow woods and some of your white stinkwoods, for instance, are the ones that grow quite big. In this specific forest structure, there are birds that prefer specific areas above the forest canopy, in the forest canopy, in the below canopy areas, and then birds that kind of like the forest floor as well. We'll touch on a few of them. I think we'll start from the bottom and we'll work our way up by discussing a few of the birds that you might encounter if you travel through the forests of the garden route. So we'll start from the more common ones. And I just want to, before we get going, just give a shout out to all the people that so kindly provided imagery for the presentation that I gave at the flock earlier in the year, the Learn About Birds conference. Mostly Mr. Mike Bridgeford and Mr. Bruce Ward-Smith. They were very kind in allowing me to use some of their pictures, and I'm kind of taking liberties to continue doing so today. In the top, you'll notice that there's a small little map just indicating in which part of the forest this bird will most likely be found. Of course, the caveat that I need to put with that is the birds don't look at this presentation of mine and then only stick to those parameters. No, they do move throughout the forest and its structure as well. So you might find some of the birds down lower or higher. It depends on where they feel like. But this is just a rough in, and we'll get to why this is slightly important a little bit later. Right, let's start with one of the easy ones, olive thrush. It's one of your Turdus thrushes that occur throughout South Africa. If you're from the inland areas, Karoo thrush will most likely be the one that you encounter most, but this one is along the coast. Most likely seen as you walk through the forest, flushing from the forest floor, flying away from you, vocalizing quite pronounced, or with pronounced staccato calls. This is one of the birds you'll find most. This is very common, very easy to identify. I'm not going to go into detail on some of the identification things. I'm sure that you all are quite familiar with bird identification, judging by the wonderful sessions that Andrew has organized over the past few weeks. So I'm sure that you'll all be able to identify them quite easily just from the pictures and identify the field marks that you'll need to look out for. In the garden route area, there's only the one thrush that you need to worry about. If you go, for instance, up north in KZN, then there's a few others that you need to start worrying about, Kurichani thrush, for instance, and if you go inland, then your life gets a little bit difficult. One that's one of my favorites, a very skulky one that you won't see very often, you'll most likely hear it, terrestrial brown ball. If you do get to see it, you're looking for a brownish bird with a characteristic white throat, and it's bubbling call. If you've got one of the smartphone applications that has some of the calls accessible, listen to that. That is most likely the only way that you'll encounter this bird is via audio. They are purely, majority, 95% of the time that I've encountered them, they were on the forest floor. So they are skulking in the lower shrubs and low bushes in the forest, normally in small family groups of between 2 to 5 individuals, and they will frequently fly across the paths that you might be walking, and that's sometimes the best opportunity for you to get an eye on them, unless they oblige you by perching as nicely on a twig like they do in this picture. One of the other ones, equally rare, equally rarely seen, is the lemon dove. Now, the easiest way to identify it is by the characteristic white face, a very dull-colored, bit of a russet belly, but then the classic grayish back with a bit of a blue section, bluish-grayish section on the neck. This bird is one of the ones that you'll most likely just see flying away from you at a great speed. Its call, if you listen to it carefully on the apps, is a very low-level, slow hooting, which is very, very characteristic. So if you do hear that, this bird is quite easy to identify. One of my favorite ones, and possibly the smallest bird in the forest, but definitely the loudest, green-backed Cameroptera. Now, this one, the name is, the Cameroptera name is from the Greek that describes its wings sticking out beyond the tail, onto the tail. And the cocked tail with the white vent is one of the easiest things to identify this little bird with. It'll be hopping in the understory, sometimes at your very feet, if it's feeling bold and courageous. And it's got a range of calls. The most prominent one that you'll most likely hear, even approaching a forest from far away, sounds like someone beating 2 big metal ball bearings together. So it's a very loud, whacking, metallic call that will reverberate throughout the forest. So for a small bird like this, without a doubt, the loudest. If you do hear that very loud, metallic, repetitive call, normally in between 4 and 5, maybe up to 7 specific notes, whack, 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 whack. That's a male doing his territorial call, and he'll be sometimes perched just above the forest floor, sometimes in the mid-canopy or the mid-understory of the forest. It's got a few other names or a few other calls as well, most prominently the one that described its former name. This one used to be known as the bleating warbler, and it does a very soft little bleat, meep, meep. That's its small little close contact call, and there's now 2 individuals walking or moving through the understory. That is something that is quite special to hear because you need to be quite close. So if you do stand still and don't make any crazy movements, these birds will get quite close, and hopefully we'll be able to hear the call that described its name in the past. Move a little bit higher up, and possibly one of the most beautiful birds that you will find in the garden route area, the white-starred robin. It's characteristic. There's very few birds in the forest that looks like this, with this absolutely lustrous yellow body. The closest one is the dark-backed weaver, but the dark-backed weaver isn't as beautiful as the white-starred robin. If you want to look for these, in my experience, I've encountered them mostly along river crossings, so small little drainage lines. That's where you'll find them. And most times that I've used to photograph them, and in cases like this, is when there are youngsters available. A young white-starred robin will sit very prominently begging for food, with the adults then having to fly out into the open in order to feed it. Its call is quite unique in the Western Cape, in the Garden Route area, where it's got this multi-note whistle that it does. In my area where I used to forest bird quite a lot in the Northern Cape or the Eastern Cape, the call was a lot more simple. So that's something to look to listen out for, and we'll touch on it again, the importance of knowing the calls of the birds in a forest, that there are differences depending on where you are in South Africa. Talking about calls, the great mimicker of the forest is your chorister robin chat. Now, another one that is quite easily identifiable if you do get your binoculars or your camera, or even just your naked eye on them: orange belly and throat and neck with this black cap and black wings. Now, these birds have got a series of calls that sound quite similar to the red-cap robin chat from KwaZulu-Natal, if you've ever counted those. That's a very monotonous whistle that they do. But don't let that fool you. They are not simple in any way. They are incredibly competent at mimicking other birds. The favorite one that I have of theirs is their mimicry of the crowned eagle. And if you know a crowned eagle call, it's normally a very repetitive whistle that the bird does as it circles above the forest. And it's quite amazing to hear a crowned eagle then calling from a small shrub on the forest floor, turning out to be a chorister robin chat. So if you do get the opportunity, spend some time with these birds and listen to the variety that they are able to produce with their calls, how many species they are able to copy. Another one known for its extreme vocalizations and skulky behavior is the southern boo-boo. The name, of course, onomatopoeic for the call. It's a duet between the pair, male, female, that sounds like boo-boo. If you go and listen to it, I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to replicate it here. I assume that most of you do know it, but it's a duet between a male and female, a call and answer that you'll sometimes hear. Sometimes just the one individual, sometimes you'll hear both completing the call. So very skulky. You won't necessarily see it in the forest, which forces you to rely on being able to identify it via its call. But like all your big bush shrikes, your large or smallish carnivorous birds, they are beautiful to look at up close with a very prominent, dangerous bill. I've been bitten by one whilst ringing many years ago, and it didn't want to let go of my finger. It's black at the top, bit of a white wing bar, but then the russet lower body is the best way to identify that one in comparison, for instance, with a common fiscal that you'll find outside of the forest. One of the specials in forests in the garden route, and a bird that is slightly more difficult to find in that area compared to other parts of the country, I found, is your yellow-throated woodland warbler. Now, this is roughly similar in size to the green-capped or the green-backed Cameroptera that we spoke about a little bit earlier, a very, very small little bird. And they move very quickly, furious pace throughout the forest canopy, or the understory and the canopy. Sometimes very difficult to get your camera on them, sometimes very difficult to get your binoculars on them. But if you are able to identify their call, it's quite easy to locate them in the understory. They've got this little staccato chip call that the pair does in order to keep contact with each other. Chip, chip, nick, nick, tick, 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 tick. Just like this little descending double or triple note call that they do. And they've got a few other ones that's more territorial. Calls are so wonderful and varied that we can have an entire presentation just describing them. Another one that you'll find in the understory, bar-throated apalus. This one is quite easy to identify if you do get your eyes on them. The characteristic black band across the throat is what will set this one apart from, for instance, the yellow-bellied apalus. Is that the right word? I hope I didn't mess that up. That also occurs in forests, so that's the easiest way to identify them if you do get your eyes on them. Again, as with some of the other birds we've mentioned, there is a duet that takes part. So these ones is called a duet by the pair. So keep an eye out and keep an ear out, and you might get two apaluses for the price of one. Possibly the most prominent bird, and I assume that each and every one of you has seen one of these, possibly not even in a forest. It might be a garden, it might be a park in a city somewhere, Cape White-eye. The characteristic white feathers around the eye denoting the name, of course. And these ones are prolific in forests, sometimes moving in large flocks. I have counted at most more than 80 birds in a flock. So you sometimes spend some time looking at white eyes flying past. They form the main component of some of these loose groupings of birds, these feeding parties in forests. So if you encounter a large flock of white-eyes moving through the understory, sometimes worthwhile just waiting a little bit, just keeping an eye out for other birds that accompany them. So that was one of the tricks that I learned, is you look for these little bird parties moving through the forest, across the trails that you might walk through as you progress on your explorations. So listen out for white-eyes in the lower canopy, and you might encounter a few other species as well that accompany them. One of those being the forest canary. Unlike your other canaries, these ones like to be a bit more sheltered inside. You do find them outside, of course, sometimes in plantations or on the forest edge, but the very characteristic streaking of the breast and lower body, so the black streaking on the yellow body feathers, is characteristic of this bird. It's quite easy to identify them flying away as well. They've got the iconic yellow rump, the yellow upper tail that most canaries have in South Africa. Cape Bactus. Now, this is the male. There is some dimorphism between the males and the females. The males have got this very, very thick black band across the breast. The females don't. They've got a little bit of brown and a little bit of a spot, almost like chin spot bactus, but not really. That's the slight difference. Their call is also something to listen out for amongst these bird parties, and you'll regularly find them together with the canaries, with the white eyes. So another wonderful bird to look out for in forests. And the one that I'll guarantee that you will hear, but I cannot guarantee that you will necessarily see it. This is like, I assume that if you should like record the number of birds that you hear on a bird outing versus the ones that you see, the somber greenbill will always fall in the first category. I can count on one hand the number of times that I've actually seen one conducting a tour compared to just the classic Willie call. Willie, you would hear repeated throughout the forest, throughout the day, non-stop. They do have a second part of the call. Willie, come and have a fight, scared. That is quite wonderful to hear. There's some slight variation across the country as well, depends on where you are. But this is one of the birds that you'll find most. It's a very olive yellowish colored greenbill, medium sized, but that white eye is the big giveaway. And sometimes if you're lucky, you'll find it perched out in the open calling, but most of the time it'll be bush diving and you'll barely get a glimpse of it. And the calls is what you'll most likely record as you go. Possibly one of the favorites, of course, like any bird with a long, wonderful paradise-like tail, African paradise flycatcher. There's some differences between them. Of course, these ones are altitudinal migrants. So in the Amatola Mountains, where I, for instance, spent most of my time, these birds would only arrive in summer to come and breed. The males, of course, starting to grow these ridiculously long tail feathers to impress the females. Females, of course, looking quite similar, just the crowns, the crests, the blue, just slightly less pronounced than it is with the male. The bird that these ones share like calls with, we'll talk about in a moment. These ones have got double staccato call. That's their main contact between individuals, between other birds. A sweet, 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 sweet. And that is sometimes confusing because there's another bird that sound very similar, and it's this one, blue mantled crested flycatcher. Again, this is the male, the female slightly less of a pronounced crown, but very similar otherwise. African paradise and the blue mantled crested flycatcher sound very similar if you just listen to their contact calls. It's a staccato two-note, sweet, 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 sweet call, sometimes very difficult to differentiate. What you'll need to rely on is the second part of their call. They've got alternative calls. The African paradise only has one, so if you listen to its call either on an app or on a website that's a repository for bird calls, you'll notice that it's got this slightly operatic whistle that it does. The blue mantle, however, has got a range of other calls that it does that is vastly different to the African paradise. So that's sometimes the best way to identify them. Fortunately for us, they are very prominent in where they sit. They are very display type birds. The African paradise, of course, showing off the tails. Like, it's very easy to see a male with a long tail flitting through the forest. And the blue-mantled crested flycatchers, they sit and display, fanning their tails to each other. Sometimes if it's just one bird, it'll still do that. So a wonderful thing to look out for if you do get to spend some time with especially these blue-mantleds. They fan their tails. Wonderful, wonderful to experience. Another member of the bird parties mixed with Cape White-eyes, Cape Baptist, your forest canaries, is the collared sunbird. Now, if you think that the yellow-throated woodland warbler was a difficult bird to photograph, try these ones. They are equally quick, equally small, and very, very, very flitty around the forest. Again, not as frequent. They're a bit more rare, but wonderful birds to see, to identify if you do get the opportunity. The males have got a very pronounced blue throat necklace, you can say. The females less prominent in their coloration. So something to look out for if you do see one. That's the difference. Females don't have that. So keep an eye out for how they look. Let's talk about the ones that most likely you'll start hearing that, or like getting the trend. You hear birds a lot more than you see them, and this is one of them. Knysna woodpecker, known for its very characteristic single note shriek scream call. It's quite wonderful. It sounds very similar to the golden-tailed woodpecker that occurs northern parts of the coast in South Africa. The Knysna woodpecker, of course, way down south. You'll hear it mostly. The other times that you might hear it is when it is whacking away at a tree. They are one of the primary cavity nesters, of course, in the forest environment, providing opportunity for other birds to possibly use nest cavities, secondary cavity nesters. So there's a few species that a lot of birds rely on for nest provision, and the Knysna woodpeckers are the woodworkers of the forest. This is the other one. So they do share overlap, but luckily their calls are different. So if you do hear a woodpecker knocking on wood somewhere, spend a bit of time. Maybe you'll hear the different calls. Maybe you'll even get to see them if it's a big open snag, dead tree that's in a clearing that you can easily look at to try and find where these birds are. They feed on slightly different things. That's the amazing thing. Why two woodpecker species, which you would think would be exactly the same, how can they share habitat? This is one of those awesome things where they share habitat, but they eat different things within it. So the one is beetles and the other one is grubs. So Knysna woodpecker, if I'm correct, I'm thinking I might now be wrong, but I think they're the ones that feed on the wood-boring beetles, but the olive woodpecker feed on grubs larvae a lot more. I hope I've got that right. One that had me flummoxed for a while until I managed to figure out the differences in the call in the southern parts of the country compared to the northern parts of the country is the black-backed puffback. Now, if you're familiar with the call, I first encountered it up north in Kruger. It's got a click whistle sound. But in the southern parts of the country, it has lost the click. It just does the whistle as it flies through the forest. Now, where, of course, the puffback comes from, and the Afrikaans name for it, snowball, is the male display that it does. It puffs out all this down feather on the body, on the back, as part of its courtship for females. Of course, vocalizing loudly, hopping through the understory whilst doing so. It is quite something to see, quite something to experience, and I do hope that you get the opportunity to do so. The puffbacks, of course, part of the shrikes that we have already mentioned. So boo-boos, bush shrikes, they kind of fall in the same grouping, and a very ferocious carnivore, insect eater in the forest. Now I'm going to move a little bit up. So those birds mostly in your understory, the ones we're going to cover now going forward a little bit, are the ones that are in your canopy layer. And possibly one of the most beautiful ones, and the name in Afrikaans is just that, mooi meisie, the African emerald cuckoo. So the call, Pretty Georgie. Pretty Georgie is something that echoes over forests in South Africa during the summer months, and most likely the easiest way for you to identify their presence. If you did get the opportunity to see them, recently during one of our campaigns during the World Cup, this was determined to be the bird that is most supportive of the Springboks with its coloration, this like absolute metallic shiny green with the yellow body. So one of the most beautiful cuckoos to see. in the forest environment. Another one that you'll most likely hear but don't always see, the black cuckoo. I'm so sad is the easiest way to describe its call, and they are a summer migrant that arrives in South Africa here from September, October onwards. Also, most likely you'll just hear them, you won't necessarily see them, but a large black bird in the forest canopy is a giveaway. Smaller one again, another one of the cuckoos, we'll cover all of them quickly together. Classes cuckoo. It's called huichi, huichi. Also echoes through the forest, similar to all the other cuckoos now, very, very vocal in their behavior. This one not as wonderfully colored as the African emerald, but still a beautiful green with white and barred on the breast. And a bird that some people might consider slightly troublesome with its propensity to call continuously during the summer months, the red-chested cuckoo. Piet my vrou, for those of you who are familiar with Afrikaans. This one's, as with the black cuckoos, are summer visitors, and from the latter part or the later spring, they'll start arriving and be quite vocal, calling repeatedly. That's sometimes the only way that you'll encounter them. It's very rare that they sit out in the open like this. It's normally only when the individuals start getting desperate, if they haven't found a mate or a mating opportunity yet, that calling will be moved outside into the open a little bit more. Although not related to cuckoos or the shrikes that we've spoken about earlier, grey cuckoo shrike is a wonderful bird to look for in the forests. These ones have got a long, elongated, downward descending whistle that it does as it flies and flits through the forest, normally also in pairs or small groups. So if you see one, there's a chance that there's another one or a few more in the immediate area. So it's the only bird that is of this pure, like ash gray color in the forest, and is quite easy to notice if it is flying in the forest canopy. Another one that has got an absolutely amazing call. If you do get the opportunity to listen to it, it sounds like a very big man being tickled. There's the African olive pigeon. These ones, either singly you'll find them, sometimes in large flocks over forests, feeding on fruit, trees that are mast fruiting. Easy to identify. This one is possibly one of the easiest birds in South Africa. So this dark, almost Kalamata olive, I think it's not a green olive, it's a black olive coloration, white speckles, and then the characteristic yellow feet, yellow bill, and yellow eye-ring. So very easy to identify, quite a large bird as well. I've even seen them in Johannesburg. So if you're from that part of the country, yep, you'll get African olive pigeons within Johannesburg as well now. It's amazing how these birds are able to utilize the human-created forest, anthropogenic forests. But if you do get them canopy area, that's where they normally perch out in the open, and that's where they normally feed. The one that's named after the area we're speaking of, possibly one of the most beautiful birds in the forest, Meisner chirocco. Of course, it's a sister species to two others that occur in the southern African region. In the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal coast, you get the Livingstons, and then you get Charlo's chirocco as well, which is in the far north on the border between Botswana and Zambia, if I'm not 100% with my memory. These ones, they are loud, they are obvious, they are very, very prominent in the canopy. You'll hear them frequently, you'll see them just as frequently, and if you do see them, they're quite easy to ID. This wonderful, beautiful crest of white, and then the red eye ring, and the absolutely amazingly colored body is something to behold. Of course, most known, as with most of your other chirocos that occur in South Africa, is the red wings. Now, an interesting note that's always nice to keep in mind when you look at chirocos. Let's talk about feather coloration. Now, that's a whole presentation that we can do just on its own, but let's focus on this bird because it's got something unique. Most birds mix colors to create coloration in their feathers. It's various pigments that are taken up from food and then extruded onto the feathers as they develop. Now, most other birds have got green on it. Let's think back to a few. There's the forest canary has got a little bit of green. The Glasses cuckoo, African emerald cuckoo has got a little bit of green. So yeah, that's all a mix. The chirocco is the only bird that has got a pure green pigment. It's even got a name, Chirocco verdin. For those of you that has got a little bit of Latin in you, verdin, of course, green. So the green coloration is a unique color that is only present in Chiracos. And it's the same with the red. Chiracin, I think, if I remember now correctly, is the name for that specific red pigment that is present in Chiracos. So a wonderful bird to see. And if you see it flying like this, yeah, it is absolutely a sight to behold. So always a highlight in forests to see them. Second only to, of course, this one, Narina trogon, is possibly one of the most beautiful birds that you will encounter in the forest. Again, a bit of sexual dimorphism. The males having a lot more green on the head than the females do. These ones, you need to be very lucky to see them. You don't necessarily get the opportunity to see them throughout the year unless they are calling, which they'll only do during the summer months. Now, I've had the privilege, the most I've seen at one time was 4 of them, and I believe that they were competing for a cavity at the time. But very rare that you will actually see one of these birds. Your best opportunity, get to know the call, which is this repetitive hoot that they do at the for short intervals. Hear that, follow that, and your chances of finding one gets a bit better. Just a comparison between the males and the females, if you do see them, to be able to tell what you are looking at. The last one, and a bird that I've only seen once in my life. I've heard them a lot, but African wood owl is something special to behold in a forest. They do occur in lush gardens as well, sometimes in plantations, but forests is what they like best. So keep an eye out for them. You won't get to see them. You'll most likely get to hear them during nights, of course. Do a night walk in a forest. It's quite an experience. That was all the canopy birds. Let's go above the canopy, the birds that occur there. And most iconic, of course, your crowned eagle. Birds that feed on tree hyraxes and Simango monkeys and vervet monkeys and sometimes even domestic pets. These ones normally seen circling above a forest, calling repetitively. They are the most amazing birds that you might encounter in a forest, the large raptors of your forest environment. Not to be missed. So if you do encounter a pair, spend some time with them. It's quite amazing to see the size of this bird. They are truly, truly giants. A smaller one, that's also a very ferocious predator, your black sparrowhawk. I've encountered them nesting in forests on numerous occasions, and the bane of those African olive pigeons that we spoke about earlier. That's what they mainly feed on. Those are the birds. So I could go on and on and on and keep you here for many, many, many more hours, but then we'll kind of run out of time, and we'll take up maybe even the next few sessions if we do continue. But let me just end this presentation with a few recommendations on how to get to know forest birds if you don't necessarily have access or quick access to a forest. And even if you do, what are the best ways to get to know these birds? Well, tip number 1 is know your area. Know where you are. Now, what does that mean? It's know which forest you're in and know which birds occur there. Now, we've touched on a few of them that occur in the Knysna garden route area. You've now got a few that you can go think of, and go and work on, and go and look at their field marks. How do you identify them? Go and listen to their calls. And with that, you can prepare. Know what to expect. And you can replicate that for every other forest that you might encounter in South Africa. Remember, there are so many of them that are slightly different each time you enter another one. So know what you are to expect in the forest that you are targeting. And now the call thing is possibly the hardest part of this, and there are no easy ways, unfortunately. I wish I could have given you the solve all tip to get to know bird calls. There's unfortunately none. There's 2 options that you have. Either you spend hours upon hours, hundreds of hours in a forest, listening to birds, trying to see birds do calls, follow the ones that you don't immediately know what they are. That's like option number 1. Option number 2 is take that list that you've just created in the previous step. Like, you've now identified your forest, you know what to expect. Go through that list, listen repeatedly to these calls, kind of pound them into your head. That's the best way. So those 2 options are unfortunately your only ways of getting to know birds. Now, if I were you, I would choose option 1. Go actually to spend the time in the forest. It's not just a great way to learn the birds or to learn about the birds, learn their behavior. You'll also be able to identify the calls and then point to which section of the forest they are busy moving in. And that will just allow you to identify them that little bit easier. The last point in this one is absolutely tongue in the cheek. If you do consider going into forest birding, work on your neck strength. Yes, you will spend most of your time bent over backwards. You'll develop some serious neck spasms. If you develop a strong neck, your life in the forest will be much, much easier. So those are the few tips. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope this has been helpful to you. At least a few tips, a few ideas on what birds to expect, what to look for, and good luck out there. Go find a forest, go do some birding, and have a wonderful time in it. Thank you. I do believe we have some time for questions, Andrew, I hope.
That's right, we do. Thank you so much, Cassie. That was great. Wonderful presentation. Love the way you went about your work. As always, great to have you on. Thank you. There are opportunities for questions, so I've asked everyone to put their questions in the Q&A box for now. For those of you that haven't looked at your screens yet, I've put up the QR code for the quiz for the webinar, so do remember to fill in the quizzes. That's how we're tracking who attends which webinars, and by that who will qualify for their attendance certificates and also the bookings for the guided experiences in January, February next year. So there are some questions in the chat box, so I'll just point those to you. So there was one from Anthony who's quite specific, just saying, what's the last bird from the underlayer level of your list of birds? And if you can go back in your presentation.
Green-backed Cameroptera, Anthony. Small little loudest bird in the forest.
Yeah, it used to be called a bleating warbler, but I think that's a bit of a weird name for them. Anyway, okay, so Joshua's got a comment on, I think, the pigments of Turacos. So
he clearly knows a lot more than I do. So it's one of those cases where the little bit of knowledge that I do have, I've tried to share, and I've clearly been very inept at it. So Joshua, thanks for pointing me in a direction where I need to strengthen my knowledge. Clearly, you've laid bare a lack of mine. So yes, I'm not able to answer as eloquently as you have. I will need to go and read up a lot more in order to strengthen my knowledge on this. For those of you who haven't seen Joshua's question, he's just pointed out that during his university studies, he's dealt with the specific coloration of the Turacos, Turacovatican and Cherasин, and the fact that they are pigments, like actual pigments, pure colors, compared to other birds that don't. So you know a lot more than I do, Josh, already. I'll need to go and touch up with that in order to be a little bit better. So thanks for laying bare a knowledge gap with me.
Yeah, well, to back you up there, Cassie, I also thought it was mixing pigments. I didn't know about this crystalline structures. So we're all learning something here today. Thanks, Joshua. I'll have to get you on for the next webinar, Joshua.
Maybe you should do this one next year.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I think I'll wrap it up there. Give everyone a chance to have a go at the quiz. So hopefully it's not too difficult. Remember, it's not so much about getting full marks, it's about learning and participating. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks to Cassie again for making the time and sharing with us. That was awesome. Really enjoyed that. And we'll see you again on Thursday for our 8th out of 10 sessions. Cheers, everyone.